Good morning, and welcome to this panel of the new rules of corporate responsibility, what's real and what's not. I would like to thank Trammell, Peter, and EarthX for inviting us to present this important topic. As we all know, corporations have many responsibilities to shareholders, stakeholders, and the community. This topic is very timely since we have political shifts every 4 years with presidential administrations and more frequently with Congress, not to mention state and local governments. What should a corporation do to be compliant with laws and regulations and serve the interests of shareholders and their stakeholders? I'd like to begin with a fable that I read years ago in Business Week. And it goes something like this. There was a frog that was in a pond, and he saw a lot of his fellow frogs being eaten by the snakes. So he went to a wise old owl in the forest and asked, "What can I do to avoid the fate of my contemporaries?" And the wise old owl looked down and he said, "It's simple. Whenever a snake comes, just fly away." So the frog, feeling full of hope and joy, hopped back into the pond, and as he did so, he was grabbed by a snake. And as he was being gobbled up, the wise old owl looked down and said, "Sorry, I just deal in concepts, not reality." So I'm an environmental litigator, and I spent many years in the U.S. Department of Justice Environment and Natural Resources Division and in private practice. So I had a deal in reality to prove my case, and corporations need to do the same thing to fulfill their fiduciary duties. This is what we're going to be discussing this morning from a number of perspectives. So at this point, I want to introduce our speakers. And first, to my far right is Michael Vandenberg. Professor Vandenberg is the David Daniels Allen Distinguished Chair in Law at Vanderbilt University Law School and co-director of the Energy, Environment, and Land Use Program. An award-winning teacher, Professor Vandenberg has published widely on bypassing polarization, private environmental governance, and the opportunity to harness law and social science to develop feasible, non-intrusive environmental governance tools. He's the author of 2 books relevant to today's topic, Private Environmental Governance, with Wharton Professor Sarah Light and UCLA Law Professor James Saltzman. And Professor Vandenberg will be happy to sign copies in the lobby after today's program. And Beyond Politics, the private governance response to climate change, with Vanderbilt physicist Jonathan Gilligan. Before joining the Vanderbilt faculty, Professor Vandenberg was a partner at Latham & Watkins in Washington, D.C., where he represented Fortune 500 companies, investment banks, and private equity firms on a wide range of environmental issues. He served as chief of staff of the Environmental Protection Agency from 1993 to 1995, and has been a visiting professor at Harvard, the University of Chicago, and the Wharton School. His research has been discussed in major media outlets such as the National Public Radio's All Things Considered, Forbes, National Geographic, USA Today, Psychology Today, and the Washington Post. He was named a 2022 Andrew Carnegie Fellow to study polarization on environmental issues, is a member of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and is a former chair of the Board of Environmental Change in Society of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. To my immediate right is Michael Yamoha, is VP Stewardship Director at EOS at Federated Hermes. He sits at the intersection of finance, climate, AI, and corporate governance, engaging with boards and investors on how sustainability risks and opportunities flow through to real-world value. So what I'm going to do is ask first Professor Vandenberg to give us a presentation on this topic, and then Michael Yamoha. Then we're going to get into a discussion, And we're going to leave time for questions and comments at the end for audience participation. So, Professor Vanderburg, I'll first point to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I apologize for the long introduction. I think we took half the program there. But our timing on this is exceptional following Andrew Winston's presentation, because I think what you'll see us all talk about are a set of things that really buttress many of the points that he just made. And what I want to do, though, is make you uncomfortable. I want to challenge some very basic assumptions that we all have about environmental law and policy and how it affects the corporate world. I'm going to say several basic things. First, I'm going to talk about how government is not going to save us. It's going to leave major gaps, and that's almost inevitable moving forward. Number two, I'm going to talk about how we need to think differently about what environmental law is. When I took environmental law, it was a subfield of administrative law. It was the Constitution and statutes and federal district court actions and policies. It's a different field now. We need to call it private environmental governance, and we need to understand how it might be able to bypass polarization in this era. To do that well, in my view, and we heard some of this from Andrew Winston, we need to be thinking about what actually drives corporate behavior on the environment. We need to avoid Disney's law, which is wishing will make it so. And if we do that, I think we can really make progress. Then what I'm going to do is wrap up very quickly with an example about how private environmental governance is affecting AI right now, and looking at some viable solutions even in this era related to AI's energy and environmental costs. So let me begin with the challenge of thinking differently about environmental fields or any field. I love this quotation from John Kenneth Galbraith: faced with a choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy with the proof. And you're an unusual audience if you're not doing the same thing right now. Do I really have to believe this? Isn't there a reason why this doesn't fit? And the first principle, according to physicist Richard Feynman, is that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. So my hope is that your mind will be open to thinking a little differently about what might otherwise be environmental law and policy. And I would say that particularly in this audience, my guess is most people here are already there. Most people are at this conference because they already get it. The challenge, what I hope to help, is to help you all think about how to communicate that to the vast majority of my students and the population out there who are thinking in a very traditional way about this. I think we've got to get out of that box. So the first step is that most people typically ask, well, what can government do when faced with an environmental problem? And again, as a former EPA chief of staff, I'm not opposed to government action at all. I'm a fan of it in the right places. The challenge is that we need to be realistic about it. And what you see here up on the screen is that we passed almost 24 major pollution control statutes between 1970 and 1990. Since then, at best one, the Toxic Substances Control Act amendments in 2016. And you might be thinking, hold it, didn't we have the Inflation Reduction Act or the IIJA? Those were subsidy statutes. They weren't pollution control statutes. They were throwing money at problems, again, which I'm okay with, but also notice that those were not durable either. Those are largely ripped up right now. So what happened? Now you can see here what correlates beautifully. This doesn't prove causation, but it shows that right at the end in 1990, of the era of adopting major new pollution control statutes, the divisions across the top line of members of the House and Senate who are Democrats and members of the House and Senate who are Republicans began to grow dramatically. And I became the EPA chief of staff in 1993, so maybe I'm the cause of this. That's where that gap opens up. And so, obviously that was a joke. What I'll do is what I do in my classrooms, which is if I tell a joke, I'll just raise my hand, and that way you don't have to worry about whether or not there's actually intended humor there. So let's go to the next point. The big challenge we face is that almost everyone who teaches in the environmental area, et cetera, and again, an exception is largely this audience, ask, what can government do when we have an environmental problem? Again, entirely appropriately. My suggestion is, though, that we need to think more deeply. We need to train our newer employees, our business students, our law students, that's what this book is about, in a different way. And here's just to give you a sense of the difficult conceptual mental model that we all have. This is a quotation from the leading text that is assigned in many upper-level undergraduate law and some business classes. And it says the simplest definition of environmental law and policy might read, quote, the use of public authority to protect the natural environment. Well, once you start with the entire definition of the field being the exercise of public authority, what does that mean when Walmart uses its market power to insist on carbon emissions reductions among its tens of thousands of suppliers? What does that mean when the Marine Stewardship Council regulates almost 20% of all fish caught for human consumption around the world? In neither case are they exercises of public authority. So my first suggestion is we need to get rid of this old mental model, and we need to think about governance, not regulation, and we need to avoid the tendency to assume if it's not government regulation, it's voluntary. If the CFO of your largest buyer of your products is insisting on something, it's perhaps not subject to a criminal enforcement, but it's certainly not voluntary. So we need to get out of the mindset of trivializing the activities that so many of us do by simply thinking of them as voluntary. So as we talk about this, and I'll leave a version of this slide for Michael next, and that'll help set up what he's going to talk about, but we need to be thinking about all the elements of a firm. We tend in law and often in economics to treat a firm as a black box, but instead we need to get behind that and think about how all the things I'm going to talk about are influenced by employees, local communities, bondholders, suppliers, insurers, et cetera, as well as all the internal elements of the firm. And I'll get back to that, and Michael will address that in some more detail. So again, what I'm trying to do is change the mental model that's out there, and there may be a couple copies of the book left. I think most of them have already been sold, so get them while you can. That's a joke. So what do I mean by private environmental governance? What's so fundamentally different here from what most of us were taught and how we tend to think and how our vocabulary drives us? In a traditional model, we have organized and unorganized interests influencing government through the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, and that then puts pressure on firms. But what happens in an era in which we don't get new statutes, in which regulations are being removed? The underlying preferences for a clean environment, for dealing with climate change, don't go away. Those two red arrows suggest they simply get redirected directly at firms. And now firms are responding to that same set of preferences that weren't satisfied by government responses in the recent time. So that's the fundamental change. We bypass the passing through of the legislative and executive branches because we have this hydraulic pressure based on preferences of the population. So what is it then that drives private governance? And I would just say that in this era, I worry about terms like corporate social responsibility and social responsible investing. Very substantial work by a range of social psychologists has demonstrated that people hold deeply different moral views on a range of different issues. And so the challenge is if we tie corporate behavior to our set of moral values, now we're triggering a deeply polarized society on issues of moral values. And now those who might disagree with one set of moral values will begin to oppose a very core set of functions which have a deep economic advantage for firms and can achieve a level of environmental protection that we won't otherwise achieve. And so what are those? And the first would be cost savings or efficiency. I'll show you a slide in a moment just about how important that is. But that is a principal driver. You can be purely economically focused, invest in a range of cost savings and efficiency that reduce your environmental impacts because the release of toxics, the release of carbon and other substances often is the product of inefficient activity. The next one, which I hear from tech executives all the time, was a principal reason why they've done much of what they've done, and I'd like to hear from the audience about that, is employee recruitment and retention. You cannot survive if you can't recruit and retain the best employees. And they have those preferences that I just mentioned that are widespread in the population. The next is something, again, that Andrew Winston talked about, the role of domestic and foreign customers and supply chains. We just finished a study that showed that 80% of the 10 largest firms in 7 global sectors are imposing environmental requirements on their suppliers. So even if you're agnostic about environmental protection, the buyers of your products may not be. And I'm going to show you another slide on a reason why that might be occurring in just a moment. Again, what we see then is also community responses. We're going to talk about AI. The responses by local communities to data centers may be dispositive for the speed with which we buy out and build out the AI system. So we're going to take a look at that. But if we ignore those community responses, then we can't achieve the economic outcomes we might otherwise want to achieve. The next, of course, is investor, lender, insurer incentives, and many of you all are very familiar with that. And then many firms will need to differentiate themselves in marketplaces as well. And we can talk more about that. Lastly, again, a point that Andrew mentioned, is the importance of foreign regulation. You may be doing business in the United States, but of course you're subject to foreign regulation as well if you're selling products abroad, and that can drive a lot of change. So it's easy to trivialize things like light bulbs and other sources of cost savings. But let's take a look here at an example of how government first started pushing hard on the development of more efficient light bulbs. Then Walmart said to its suppliers of light bulbs, if you can make a light bulb that costs under $10 a bulb and is more efficient and looks attractive, then we'll make it our house brand. They did, as did then many other companies as well. Does that matter? You might think light bulbs are almost the symbol of triviality in this area. But let's take a look at this chart. What does that suggest? That suggests that US household per capita electricity consumption was going up almost every year from the time of the Second World War. It leveled off and started going down in about 2010. What does that correlate with? It correlates almost exactly with the widespread uptake of LED light bulbs, which are vastly more efficient than the existing bulbs. Again, we can't prove causation, but there's a remarkable correlation there. Does that matter? US households emit as much carbon as all of the sources in all of the countries in Central and South America. So when we get a leveling off and then a decline in electricity use per capita in American households, that has global relevant effects. And I would say that as we get more pressure from AI on the ability of the electric grid to supply electricity, that household efficiency begins to provide space for some of the growth of AI moving forward. Do corporate managers who engage in the sort of supply chain contracting that we found is so prevalent in the US and around the world, do they simply reflect woke values or some other set of preferences? And one argument is, well, no, not if they're worried about how their employees and their customers and their local communities might respond to the activities of their Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers. So what we did is, with an interdisciplinary team, we studied how do those communities view the moral responsibility of firms in relation to their Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, listed as A, as B, and C here. So if A is the corporate buyer, and B and C are the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers, in law, as you all know, a company is typically inside the legal boundary of the firm. It can't be liable for the activities of its independent third-party contractors. But what we found is that people who are in their communities, employees and customers, ascribe moral responsibility to the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers that is almost as strong as the moral responsibility they ascribe to the company that's buying the products in the first place. So there is a core economic driver that explains part of that broad amount, wide amount of support for corporate supply chain activity. And so let's turn to AI for just a second, and I'll turn it back over to Michael. So how might this notion of private environmental governance, when the private sector is motivated through the drivers I just mentioned to perform governmental functions in this era in which we have major gaps in government action? One answer might be by providing information. And in some research that we just completed, what we found is that there's a remarkable lack of information in the public about the effects of AI, both in terms of its energy demand and its environmental effects. And one example is roughly 1/5 of the American population isn't sure that AI is using electricity. So if you think about how hard it is to motivate behavior change, if you're not even quite sure about that, how do you get to the point of thinking about whether you're going to make different choices about AI based on its environmental effects if you're not even sure about its electricity effects? The other thing we then did is we said, well, what if we take a common set of inferences and we run them through the 4 leading energy calculators that are out there? So let's assume you did want to know about the energy effects of AI. Could you find out? And what we found is that the same set of inputs produce 58 times different outputs. So very, very hard to learn, even if you wanted to. So what we're working on now with an interdisciplinary team is a whole range of different ways in which private governance might be able to fill the gap. We cannot expect the federal government and most state governments to do this and allow AI to develop rapidly and successfully, but to do so in a way that has lower energy and environmental costs. And one answer is, let's come up with a common set of metrics for how we measure the energy and environmental effects of AI. That's not in existence right now. Let's think about developing a user interface. So you could decide that you're going to have a lens through which you can express your preferences for lower energy demand or lower environmental effects when you use AI. Let's see whether some AI firms have competitive reasons why they might want to adopt some of the disclosure systems that might change to different corporate and individual user behavior. Right now, if you're Hilton Hotels or the Anatole Hotel, the carbon emissions associated from the AI use here are not attributed to you. Because those are outside of the emissions that you're typically expected to report. So let's think about changing or modifying the Scope 3 emission standards that are used by many, many firms to think about ascribing that responsibility, and that way Hilton now has an incentive to say to its AI firms, give me AI with lower energy costs and lower carbon emissions, for example. We can also imagine that kind of supply chain contracting pressure being quite effective, and ultimately we might end up in a place where we have a private certification standards and labeling system, which we sometimes think of as Energy Star for agents. Lastly, and what we're seeing all over the country are various forms of community benefit agreements. That is, AI firms, even though they're not legally obligated to, are often entering into a range of different agreements to try to account for the community's strongly held values as a way to move forward. That's another form of governance, even if it's not imposed at the national, state, or even local government level. So with all that, what I wanted to simply close with is we do need a different mental model. It requires getting out of that mindset of simply asking, what can government say? We need to ask, what can any organization do? We need to think about those drivers and be realistic about them. And then when we do that, we can begin to see that there's some opportunities for the most challenging problem perhaps that we face today in the environmental area, which is how do we satisfy that electricity demand without blowing through many of the other environmental commitments we've made. To do that, we've got to get inside the firm, and that takes us over to Michael's presentation.
Thank you very much. It's hard to always come from this Michael to this Michael. But I think you laid out a very good foundation in terms of how the corporate structure works. And I would like to go back to a couple of slides that you had earlier on about the Scope 3. I mean, we've been talking about Scope 4 equivalent and avoided emissions for a long time. Sometimes I feel like I'm already accounting sort of out in terms of how much we can account. But in terms of my background, just so that you know where I'm coming from and how I'm laying it, I have no slides, so I'm just going to be very animated in terms of how I sort of talk about this, is the fact that, you know, I'm an economist by training. A few years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I remember at University College London, I set out to try to figure out what really is the core lever to move a lot of the climate and also the sustainable development agenda. And I struggled for almost the first 2 years of my research, and then eventually I came to this fusion on this idea of coherence in policy. But that was very economist on my part as an economist. I cannot avoid to think about trade-offs in everything, right? And Charlie and I were talking, and I said, you know, people will call it trade-offs, practicality, reality. I just call it constraint. I want you to go back to your home and how you address your financial resources, your well-being, everything. All sits within what you earn, how much you have, your family composition, the dynamics of your sort of microculture, and all of those different kinds of stuff. The behavior that, Michael, you referenced, right? And I think it is a very important place for us to start from, whether we are talking about regulation, governance, or legislation, anything that you can think of. It is fundamental to realize that there is not unlimited resources. I'm not saying that as a defense, but I want you to sort of picture that in your mind first as I go through this sort of narrative about how we go about our work when it comes to engagement. So first is constraint, which is also in part dealt a blow by the fact that we don't have unlimited sort of resources. And then the other part that I always come back to from somebody who, you know, talks to a lot of board executives and others is this idea that even if you don't have unlimited resources, and even if you have constraint, there is a reality that the science is very informative. But here is where sometimes I challenge some of my climate sort of peers and scientists that I work with. And I always tell them that science is an evolution of experiments within a process that allows us all to challenge each other. And I use the word evolution because, what is a chemical formulation today does not mean absence of new formulations. What it means is that everybody is going to come up with some form of innovation, even within the already existing structure of innovation. And what you want within every innovation is this constant evolution, right? So science, the climate science is never set. This is why the IPCC meets every so often to look at existing new knowledge that informs our work. That behavior is how we in this space also need to embrace. We can't keep saying 1.5 like it's set in stone. We can't keep saying net zero like that is the forever metric. But we have to constantly update the research and the thesis and the experimentations around some of those evidence. That is the only way we begin to have more societal confidence. Many of us may know this, but back in the 90s, the IPCC fell on a very bad public disaster. There was all this politics that almost led the whole IPCC establishment down the drain. That bad reputation came from supposedly an internal exchange among a lot of the scientists that some evidence of climate, non-climate related information were being hidden. Once the public loses faith in an institution, and both of you have worked with a public institution before, it's hard to bring them back up. So we in the climate space have to look at the way we communicate sort of climate and sustainability related information. It cannot be a Bible. It cannot be and all of that. We have to allow ourselves to absorb new information, understand the constraint, in my view, the trade-offs, and also be very much cognizant of the fact that we don't have infinite resources. So how does that relate to the work that I do? That's where I wanted to bring it down to. When Michael was talking, Michael was referring to the corporate structure. So in my world, what I do every day is that we have investments in several sort of portfolio of companies. Some publicly listed, some private, and others, somewhere in between. We have clients. The clients are mostly institutional sort of asset owners. So you can think of the big pension funds around the world. And my job is that I need to call up most of these public companies, or sometimes privately held companies, and sit down with the executives and the board members and talk about exactly what I just mentioned. If you are in an American sort of paradigm via the Delaware sort of mechanism or sort of fiduciary system where most companies are registered, although that is changing as we see Texas and other places sort of trying to attract some of these publicly listed companies, you have to know that you owe, as a board member, your first allegiance is to the shareholder. And that is not saying that that is something that somebody came up with. It's actually by law. Your fiduciary duty is not to you who is sitting in the room unless you're a shareholder. So your first call under the business judgment rule of the Delaware sort of system is that you need to think of the shareholder. And in this case, the shareholder is the one who is invested in the company, whether through equity or bonds or other forms of instruments. So when you have sort of, I would say, almost like a constitutional mandate, right? And again, I have lack of a better words, a constitutional mandate for a group of people who have been entrusted with the responsibility of a large corporation. And their first duty is to ensure a fiduciary to the shareholder, not to you or everybody across the United States or across the entire world. That changes the way we think about perception. My academic supervisor, when I was doing my PhD, Michael Grubb, at a UCL, wrote a book about climate economists, and he says that it's about perception of risk. And perception of risk is so fundamental because when I said that think about yourself in your home, every decision that you make, or in your company, in your small company, or in your academic institution, every decision you make is going to be based on your perception of risk. Whether you're going to change your roofing, your light, your chairs, you are going to deem things that are more risky more important. And so when a group of board of directors, sometimes 8, 10, 12, 15, get together in a room, what they have to think about is the risk to the shareholder. Because remember, in the US, the shareholders can find a way to sue the board, although those are harder to prove sometimes, right? So the board has to look at those fundamentals more carefully. And if I'm a board member, right? If I'm in a room and I'm talking to other board members, I have to think about the rational process by which we come to a conclusion. The board's duty is mergers and acquisition, strategy. So think of the long-term sort of climate effects. They have to look at all of those things. But if you're a believer in science, and if you're very math-oriented like all of us are, I love statistics, there's something about uncertainty if you're in a boardroom or in any decision making. Think about your kids who are going to go to college 20 years from now, and you are saving, and you're looking at a pattern of return on investment across different investment portfolio. College cost is going up, and you're wondering, am I going to be able to save enough for them for college? You're only certain about 5, probably to 8 years. You don't know if you're going to have a big recession or depression. There's so much uncertainties. They are harder to plan, and everybody can come up with a scenario. And if you think about the IPCC scenarios that we've come up with, right? Most of people don't realize that at the start of every negotiation around integrated assessment models, we have over 500 models coming from different countries, some from the US, some from different parts of the world. And they have to negotiate those sort of models into a small chunk that they agree on. Sometimes it comes down to about 100 or 99 of them. And that is what turns out to be the publication that we see around about the executive summary and the different sort of trajectory of where things are flying to. And so ultimately, when you have greater uncertainty, even beyond 2030, when you have greater uncertainty, 2045, 2050, less so even 2100, how does a corporate board member oversee an executive that have a mandate that often runs 3, 5, 6, 7 years? The average tenure of a CEO or the average tenure of a board, depending on which sector you are in. How do you think in that long-term trajectory when you're also faced with that constraint, the trade-offs, and also the lack of unlimited sort of resources? How do you bring all of that into your portfolio when it costs you money to do business? And I think that's how we have to picture the challenges about the future. The future, as you said, is not this dream only. The dream is important because that's where inspiration comes from. I've always said that 1.5 net zero is aspirational. I've always said it from the very beginning. To get there, the IPCC has talked about it. You're not going to get there through technology alone. In fact, if you look at the different levels of the movement, it is all about behavior change. I always advise people, go back to the footnotes of the IPCC research. I have reviewed some of them, and I have contributed to some of the review process. It is very fundamental, and it's very, very important to look at the level of behavior change. How we, you and I, go about our business. If we understand AI and the energy consumption, maybe we'll use it differently. If we understand the impact of this plastic, maybe we'll think differently. But I also want you to think about the trade-offs. You can't just go ahead and turn the machine like that. It's going to take a while. And we cannot only think about the future. We also have to think about the present. It is very important for us to be able to balance things out, because sometimes I think we scream of the future so much, we forget that there are people who are hungry, who have no homes, who have no shelter, who are struggling today. And I think those elements are very important when you're thinking about how you look into some of the solutions that we have towards the future. I think AI presents a different sort of challenge. One of the last things I want to leave you, and then we can get into the discussion, and I have been working on this, and I talk to companies about this all the time, is this idea, and it's not a popular thing, that climate is not the only consequential things that we face in society. There are so many things that could derail climate without policy by itself. And we can have the best policies, as we see already happening in the EU, right, in the world, and everything could still be derailed. We have an increasing change in demographics. Aging is a big one of them. Technology is a big chunk of what we are about to face as well, which is AI and other sort of forms of technology that are emerging. Climate is right there. I wrote a piece, and I have a book coming up called, Our Missed Opportunities. And I talk about this because it is very important to really think about the fact that sometimes when you are so narrowly focused on something, that is how you are designed to fail. And I think the UNDP, when I was working at the Natural Resource Defense Council, at the time back in 2015, before Paris, I was working on China and India policies ahead of the Paris Agreement. And I was very happy that UNDP was trying to really bring together all the different arms of the different organizations to talk about this concept of coherence. That we cannot pass or have Paris and just leave it there. We have to think about everything else that is as important and relevant tomorrow. Because those things are what are going to curtail or move our climate discussions. And I wish we had listened. And I think now we are back to exactly where some people actually talked about, that back in 2015, we needed to kind of keep 1.5 aspirational and not a mathematical formula to our future. And I think we are back to the reality that we have to start thinking about those sort of constraints and those sort of ideas around resources and those sort of things around coherence that are fundamental to the future. And when you go to the boardroom, it is fundamentally the same thing. These board members are battling the idea that they don't have unlimited resources. There are constraints they have to deal with today that could turn a company upside down. And they have to embrace that the future is uncertain, just like the science actually says it's uncertain. And I think that is fundamental if you're in this room. And so how we communicate about climate change and sustainability is as important about how we solve it. Let's not talk about it as if it is the gospel. It is part of the gospel, but the solution to that aspiration is how we bring it back to the constraints, the trade-offs, and the resources that we have to use to enable them.
Great. Well, thank you both for that perspective. You both talked a bit about climate, energy, policies, what companies do, what they consider, and the like. And I just want to kind of ask a bit about kind of the study of climate and energy, kind of as probably the ultimate multidisciplinary activity, as discussed by Dr. Stephen Koonin in his book Unsettled. Dr. Koonin is a climate physicist. He spoke at this conference in 2022, and he was the Undersecretary for Science under the Obama administration, Department of Energy. And this is how he defines climate science. And that is, climate science involves many different scientific fields encompassing the quantum physics of molecules and the classical physics of moving air, water, and ice, the chemical processes in the atmosphere and ocean, the geology of the solid earth, and the biology of ecosystems. It also includes the technologies used to do the science, including computer modeling on the world's fastest machines, remote sensing from satellites, paleoclimate analysis, and advanced statistical methods. Then there are the related areas of policy, economics, and the energy technologies aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Do you find that the companies that you deal with kind of understand kind of the complexity of this science? I'll start with you, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what many companies are dealing with. I was a sustainability manager at most of you know the company Bechtel Corporation for a number of years, and Bechtel built mega infrastructures around the world. Hoover Dam, the famous one that we always talk about. If you go to the UK right now, I was there when we were building sort of the new Queen Elizabeth underground, the Chernobyl containment, all of those different things. And I deal with this right off the back. I mean, we have organizations that have translated the science into calculable, a good target setting for all companies, right? Which is things like the SBTI through organizations like the World Business, Council for Sustainable Development and the BRI and the likes. They've all kind of trying to find a way to design something that works for businesses so that businesses can leverage and sort of look at how they can set your goals. But the reality is, a lot of these things are based on global sort of alignments, right? I didn't mention this, but when I started out college, before that, because I didn't go to school here in the U.S., I went to school in Ghana, where I'm from, and also studied in the U.K. You kind of start specializing very early on, and one of my specializations was math, physics, economics, and geography. Weirdly, I didn't know what I was going to do in the future, but that's kind of the weird thing I ended up. We call it Arts 1. So that was kind of my initial thing. And now, a few years down the road in my career, I realized that all of these things have come to help my career in a weird way. What we don't understand about a lot of the climate models is that it depends on which kind of resolution, right, that you are looking at some of the climate models from, right? The higher or the lower you are from an observable point of view in terms of the climate dynamics is going to differ by and large. And that is hard when you are a company and you're trying to set goals and targets, and you're having to it's actually called downscaling. That's the kind of scientific term for it. And you're trying to downscale a model to your micro sort of business structure, whether located around the world or some small part of Oklahoma or Texas. It is hard. And we know the level of downscale is going to increase the uncertainty range, right? So some of these models are inherently not applicable, but they provide a very good way, I call it alignment, for a company to sort of apply. So the science is very difficult. And when I was talking earlier on, I said there's a difference between science and what you do kind of in practice, right? I'm an economist. I always say we economists, we lie 100% of the time and we come back and apologize for it. You see that happen every day. I'm not calling this lies, but what I'm trying to say is we predict every quarter something is going to happen. Something changes, we come back and tell you the reason why it didn't change. I'm not saying that's what physics does to sort of climate, but what I'm trying to say is that for a business, you are just challenged by the downscaling uncertainties that are associated with a lot of the climate models, and translating that into your raw business model is inherently very difficult. But you have these tools that I mentioned earlier on, like the SBTIs and the likes, to help you kind of follow along with the world. That's how I look at it, follow along with the world, right? Because some of these gases are measured in labs, right? I worked on methane a little bit with another colleague of mine called Diana Glassman, and I did partake in a lot of the University of Texas Austin sort of methane sort of work, and we always talk about the idea that when a gas is moving, if you're very scientific, when a gas is moving, it's actually very harder to measure. That's why you want to have it in the volume, right? In a way, even in the satellites we measure, methane, once they disperse, it's like, pff, you're gone, right? But once they come from the source, you're able to measure directly. So that's kind of the reality you have to deal with. We still today find it hard to really get the grasp on the methane. We're using different technologies to measure, and oil and gas companies and other companies are trying to solve it. This is what it means by something done in the lab and bringing it to reality. You're going to throw a lot of money at it. Sometimes government incentives are going to be thrown in on it. So companies are trying to innovate along with the scientific sort of status we have right now. But it is not easy when you have to translate it into real cents and dollars for what you do every day.
Well, thank you. And Professor
I think that's a good example, the question and answer of why interdisciplinarity is so important, even outside of the climate science itself. And I think one advantage of sustainable businesses is that businesses face real-world problems. I think it's one reason why the psychologists and economists in business schools are often, I think, providing some of the most valuable insights, because they have to test their ideas with the real world. I heard an engineer recently explain that the reason you see a little less peer review in engineering is that the natural world provides that. If a building falls down, the engineer didn't do the job correctly, right? And I think what happens is, by the time you get to be a PhD, sorry for attacking PhDs, you've developed a mental model. There are certain things you can think about. An economist can think about rational thought and pecuniary motivations with maybe a little behavioral economics thrown in. A sociologist can think about group behavior. A psychologist about human psychology. A lawyer assumes the problem is always about law. And what makes this area, I think, so exciting but also so difficult is that it requires the insights of all of these areas, because we have incredibly hard problems that span every discipline that's out there. So it's one reason why I really love working in this field, and why I think people in this field are some of the most open-minded that you'll see across academic and other settings.
Great. Well, thank you both. And let's talk a little bit about disclosure. And that was, the SEC proposed rule. It's kind of a good example of a political shift. And Professor Vandenberg, you discussed that quite a bit kind of in your book, the private environmental governance. So in March of 2024, during the Biden administration, there was a proposed rule to enhance the standardized climate-related disclosures for investors. March 27, 2025, the SEC under the Trump administration votes to end defense of the climate disclosure rule. And so let me ask you both, maybe starting first with you, Michael. What impact do you think this has? How do corporations now kind of react to this? What is it that they disclose? Why do they disclose it? Is there any reliance any further on kind of the proposed rule from 2024? Or do companies think, well, based upon 2025, there's no need for any of these disclosures? What's your view of that?
I mean, you raise a very good point. I'm a very big buff of history. Most people don't realize that in the U.S., after the Depression, one of the core mandate of the SEC was to try to kind of bridge the information gap, right? Which is to make sure that investors have access to similar information, right? And most people don't realize this. I know every time I talk about this to a lot of people, they cringe. The idea that in the first 100 or so more years of America's existence, if you were a corporation, you did not just go ahead and do business. Congress actually gave you certificate of incorporation. It wasn't a state of department office or anything like that, right? A bank, and it actually had a limit. Congress, and that was born out of the fact that, if you remember in the era of great explorations by the Europeans, right? A lot of these entities were private armies and whatnot. And I bring this into sort of the disclosure era in simple terms that I think what the SEC back then was trying to do was to step in because investors and many other regulations around the world had said climate was a fundamentally important, financially relevant information, and that it is important for everybody to disclose something and then have all investors have the same level of information. So forget about whether you believe in climate or not. It was just that this is something that is financially relevant and impacts business, right? Sea level rise impacts shipping. Businesses are making real-time decisions about how to move goods around the world. High heat waves impact sort of workforce populations. We know that. We know that water stress is a big issue. So there are these sort of direct financial implications on the balance sheet that could be impacted. So if you're a business, you're not only looking at the United States, but even if you're looking at the United States, you have to look at California, you have to look at Colorado, you have to look at other places that are going to require you. And those state-specific guidelines on their own sort of changes requires you to disclose something, right? So I don't want to mention the EU. Everybody knows what the EU does. So if you're a global business, yes, you have to disclose all of those things. I am a firm believer that most businesses in America do not just plan every 4 years. They plan for the long term. So we are still going to see some disclosures because every sort of company is trying to make sure that they are prepared for that aspirational future that I talk about. So I think disclosure is going to be here, whether the SEC sort of goes back to it or not. Again, that is outside of the economic view. It's more political and stuff. But we rely on disclosures to engage. I do rely on disclosures to engage. A lack of disclosure leaves room for greater uncertainty, right. And that's what we kind of push for all the time.
Thank you. And Professor Vandenberg, how does this kind of fit into the private environmental governance?
I can't think of a better example of why we need private environmental governance. Global disclosure is partly driven by the EU and others, partly by California and other states, although some of that is subject to litigation right now. But the average investor cares about risk. And so climate is not de-risked because it's unpopular as a polarized issue. It's an economic risk. And that means that your carbon emissions are an economic risk if the corporate buyers of your products have carbon limits. Those are market risks. And if you're in the middle of a supply chain or if you have investors who care about these issues, those are all financial risks. So from my perspective, I can't think of a better example of an area in which the basic hydraulic drivers of pressure to disclose risk coming from a lot of sources produce disclosure requirements, and those then get captured through disclosure systems like the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP, the WRI, WBCSD, Greenhouse Gas Inventory. Those are all private systems that basically preceded the SEC's movement in this area. The SEC had a guidance in 2010 and then tried to put it into a rule. I would just say, as a simple matter, in the current swinging pendulum and polarized environment, if you don't put a rule in place in the first year in which you're in office, you're making a political mistake. And that happened here. And whatever those forces are, because whether it's the Congressional Review Act or a change of administrations, you're not going to produce solid policy. So did that rule, was it shaped exactly the way it should have been? I think we could all argue about different aspects of it. But the core notion that disclosing material risks to reasonable investors is a function of government, I think should be indisputable, and we shouldn't ignore risks because we find that they fit outside of our group identity, that we've excluded something as being possible to think about. And I think what's valuable about the private governance framework is that it reflects those preferences of investors and employees and consumers across the political spectrum. It can't be gerrymandered. It's not subject to quirks in the Electoral College. It's a more hydraulic, oddly enough, form of market democracy, and that is reflected in the private sector's efforts to generate disclosure standards that have now survived, even though the public federal system has switched back and forth. So I think that's really important. One other just quick sort of a shape on what Michael said, which is just that his point, I think, is right about companies originally being formed by governments. We think about the Dutch East India Company. We think about Britain. The Tea Party was tea thrown into a river based on a private company, but it was formed by the British government, right, to trade. So that was originally true. By the early 1800s, the Supreme Court was recognizing a firm as an entity in the Dartmouth case, and then we started seeing states charter companies initially to perform public functions like putting a bridge over a river. But within about 20 or 30 years, the states began allowing companies to be organized without a specific act of a legislature and to be formed by a company if you simply follow the requirements. And that's where we stand today. So by the early to mid 1800s, we started seeing companies being able to be formed for purely private purposes as a matter of state regulation. And I think, what does all that mean as to disclosure? I think what it means is that we're going to see some heterogeneity, some differences among the states on disclosure issues, but the private governance provides an umbrella on some level that we can be quite certain that even if the political system doesn't reflect material, environmental, economic risks, the private system is going to continue to put pressure on disclosure of those risks. And that's the way I view the system, and that's what we talk about in our book.
Great.
And I want to say something very briefly. One of the things that we also have to recognize is that in the U.S., the way we make laws and how laws are made are not the same like the EU, right? And so, we have sort of a checkered board system here. And sometimes, we wait for things, post-ante, all of those different things. I think we have to recognize that. So sometimes, people get excited, oh, the EU passed this. That may take a decade or so before the U.S. will do something like that, right? Because things have to morph to a certain level before Congress, through the federal government, would take any relevant action. And sometimes, from a market perspective, I like to be selfish sometimes here. I always say, I like inefficiency sometimes. Like I told you earlier on, one of my professors, who's a physics professor, told me, there's nothing 100% efficient. There's a rationale to it, because you need a negative feedback loop to make it better and better over time. So I like physics sometimes, and I think that's sometimes how regulation should be. It's like, you can't get it perfect. You may start in the wrong way, but there's, I believe the framers may not be, the most smartest people in the world, but they were still smart in their time to think of a system like this that kind of functions for itself and always kind of rebuilt itself. So I think we will get to a point where we will see something. I'm not sure when. I don't have the crystal sort of ball to see everything, but I do think there's a future where disclosures become more standardized.
Okay, well, thank you both for that. Let me turn back to something, Michael, you mentioned when you're talking about the poor, and I want to get back into that a little bit. There are many people in this country and around the world who are poor, and they live on a pretty low fixed income. They only have limited resources for heat, for groceries, for gas, for other needs in their life. Many people die from cold.
Yeah.
Many people die from cold. It's a very painful death. It's a long death. A lot of the elderly stay in bed because they don't have enough heat just to stay warm. And that, in a few weeks they could die from that. What's the responsibility of corporations to kind of address those needs so that there's kind of reliable energy, there's affordable energy that would keep people alive? What's your view?
This is an area that is very important to me. As somebody who worked as a consultant for the World Bank and also the Asian Development Bank early in my career, I was very fortunate to travel around the world. I did work in the Philippines, I did work in sort of Kenya, I was also done work in Peru and other places. And this is actually one of the questions that comes back to a lot of boardroom engagement with utilities. They always talk about reliability, affordability, right? And it's so important, and you're right. We've seen deaths happen. This is not imagined stuff. Some people on the other side of the climate discourse will say, well, we warned you, this is why we say climate is real, right? And then some people on the other side will say, well, we are shutting down the coal plants and we don't have the cheap, reliable energy that we need, right? So in this instance, some of us may remember early years when we were studying math, right? There's something called story problems. If John has this, then that, and that, right? This is a classic example of a story problem, but it's very real. And for a lot of board members and executives, keeping the lights on is so important every single day, not just for the future. They have to think about the trajectory of decarbonization in that sense. And it's not easy because sometimes the solutions, the technological solutions are not necessarily there to help them today, whether hydrogen, especially on a scalable sort of platform. And I think, I won't name the company name, but there's a utility company up north which kind of has shut down a number of sort of coal plants, which is good, right? And got into a very bad winter and there were hundreds of deaths up north and getting sued for it. The thing was, you had the coal plants, couldn't you just turn them on? Why did you just keep them off because of emissions or something like that? I think companies are really kind of balancing the need right now. We are seeing combined cycle gas plants, we've seen dual feedstock plants, so you can keep, or sometimes allowing instead of some plants to be online during the winter seasons and whatnot. I think this is a challenge. EPRI is working with the utilities to try to figure this out while trying to address sort of a greater decarbonization sort of efforts. And I don't think there's going to be one easy solution. On a global scale, I remember when India said it was going to build, India and China, thousands of utility based out of fossil fuel. And there was kind of a backlash around it. The concept of energy poverty came up quite a lot. And as someone who's traveled through all of these different countries by and large, my grandma was growing up, would go to the farm and cut out trees and put it over there and lit a fire. I learned how to lay those fires, and they would cook with charcoal, and it wasn't good. The UNDP came out with clean cook stove as a very good way to sort of help. How do you kind of get people to have power when the climate is changing faster and the technology is not moving faster? So I'm always very kind of careful about decarbonization in the utility sector because it brings life and death today, not tomorrow.
Yes, and Professor.
That's a great segue into, I think of this on two levels. And the first triggers exactly off of what Michael just said, and I have a little different perspective on that. I don't think you can think about justice or equity unless you think about, as it relates to climate, both intra-generational, so what happens to people living today, buying power today, and intergenerational justice. Climate change will last for about 100 generations, given what we know. If we stop emitting today, we've affected the climate for roughly 10,000 years. That means that the offspring of the most disadvantaged populations will be harmed by what we do today for roughly 100 generations. So if you genuinely care about justice or equity, then unless you're willing to discount the value of those future lives very substantially, you have to think about solving that problem. In my own view, that is not necessarily in tension with exactly the problem you just mentioned, because people will often say, well, I want lower electricity rates. And my answer on that is, no, you want lower electricity bills. it's not the rate in the abstract that you care about. It's the amount of electricity used times the rate. And what we tend to do is miss the opportunity to achieve climate justice or equity or affordability because we don't invest enough in the efficiency of households. And we saw that with my light bulb example. Remarkable downturns. There was no loss in beneficial outcomes there. There was actually a savings. And we were solving the climate problem at the same time. So not in every case can you do that, but I think we have to be, when we're thinking about intra-generational justice among us, we have to be very, very careful not to be led down the road into a dead end, which is affordability versus dealing with the climate problem. I think those are exactly the same answer, and they're the answer through the efficiency or cost savings examples that I provided in that early slide earlier today. There are major investments we can make at the household and corporate and other levels that will enable us to avoid having to make this really hard trade-off between, do you provide power that affects future generations, or do you find ways to reduce that demand a little bit? And we're seeing that with our AI efforts as well.
Right.
Can I say this
Please,
in the last minute? I think, Michael, I agree with you, but this is where my capital constraint sort of argument sort of comes in. In the U.S., we have a lot of issues right now with transmission that we are trying to grapple with. If you are a utility company and you have to go to the Public Utilities Commission and you have to go and argue about rates, it is voluminous in terms of the way you have to get an approval, and the way the rates are determined includes sort of future capital expenditures along generation and also transmission, which eventually doesn't translate into the rate per se, but does translate into how much you pay for a bill, right? In terms of actual sort of dichotomy in that sense.
We could have a longer conversation about that.
I just wanted to show where
there is a history of over-prediction of demand in the industry, and there's literature on that suggests it induces the use of greater investments in capital, which then have to get a return, and we go on and on like that. We could have a longer conversation about the implications of that. Maybe that's for next year's EarthX.
Yes.
Maybe next year. So, well, I want to thank you both. We only have a few minutes left. Any concluding thoughts from anyone in the audience who would like to kind of contribute to this discussion, or with Professor Vandenberg or Michael? I know it's a little difficult, I think, with the technology here for kind of audience participation. So let me go back to the two of you. We have 1 minute and 40 seconds left.
So I'll just wrap up with
Thoughts?
where I started, which is we can't assume that government is going to solve these problems. It's going to leave gaps. We can't just assume the question is, what can government do? We have to say, what can any organization do? And you heard that in the conversation today. We have to understand that the drivers, in some cases, include the moral sentiments of corporate managers or investors or whomever, but very often just raw economic advantages that occur from dealing with the environmental problems. And then I think, given the substantial challenge we face from AI, deploying all those to reduce the pressure on the electric grid in terms of costs and environmental effects of AI is just an enormous opportunity, and one that we're hoping to build out research on quite a bit over the next several months.
Well, thank you. And Michael, we have about 50 seconds left.
Yeah, I just want to encourage you, go back to the kitchen table. This is really, it's complicated, but it's not that complicated. Think about this in your own roles, in your own sort of home, and how you come about decisions, right? It's not as logical as it may sound. I mean, behavior economics, as you mentioned, is fundamental. Think about the constraints. Think about the trade-offs. And just think about the future, but also the present right now. And I think that's how you kind of end up in a very good place in terms of the choices that we make. And no choice is going to be perfect, right? I am not a believer that we're going to have a perfect solution. I think we're going to have more of a chaotic, and history is our teacher on that one.
Well, thank you for that. I can't think of having two better speakers, two more people with expertise on this subject than the two of you. Thank you on behalf of EarthX for being here, for participating in this program, and for members of the audience. We're going to be around for this conference, so if you have any questions or you'd like to discuss anything, especially maybe Professor Vandenberg's book and the like, please approach us. So with that, we're going to conclude. Thank you very much for being here.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chuck.